Welcome to this video series where I'm going to be introducing my new book, which is called Integrative Person-Centred Counselling. What I'm going to try to do is, over about 10 separate videos, is talk about how we can, as therapists, create a model from the person-centred approach, but one that includes the variety of other counselling psychotherapy modalities. In this video series, I want to try and convince you that we shouldn't necessarily rely just on one school of thought, and that it's more helpful to use many. By the end, I'm hoping that you'll be more fluent, let's say, in the language of psychotherapy, understanding where each model, from existential to psychodynamic theory to Gestalt psychology, can make you a better, perhaps, or more humane counsellor. So let's start with the person-centred counselling. Now, Carl Rogers is not a name which often makes its way into the pantheon of Western philosophers, though perhaps I think it should, because he did something which I think was revolutionary. Where Freud saw the therapist as an interpreter of unconscious symbols and the behaviorists as a kind of technician of habits or conditions, Rogers invited us to consider something far more humble, yet I think it's infinitely more radical, that the act of being with another person, in our presence, in empathy, might itself be the cure. Be the thing that really makes a difference to somebody's emotional well-being. And Rogers created his famous triad: empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard, with the intention that they weren't kind of techniques. They rest on the assumption that the human being, if accepted without condition, if truly seen, will tend towards growth and meaning in life. And he called this the actualizing tendency. And I don't think Rogers' optimism here was naive. I think he was deeply aware of what disrupts human flourishing. He was very much aware that, there's a darker side to human experience. And he linked this with a concept that he termed the conditions of worth, which are kind of societal and familial demands that in a sentence form sound something like, "You're only acceptable if." And these conditions distort the self. They fracture a person's personality, and they become the kind of interior architecture of your shame, of your embarrassment, of your lack of belief in yourself. And I think it's here that we arrive at the central paradox in therapy that Carl Rogers figured out, which is that people often come saying that they're in search of change, they want change. But actually what he figured out is that people are really in search of permission, permission to be who they are. It's not that they lack the will to change, but that they've been taught countlessly over and over again to mistrust their own experience. So the therapeutic task in person-centered therapy is not to impose a solution, but to create the kind of relationship in which the client finds the solution themselves. And I think that this viewpoint stands gently, I guess, in opposition to many of the prevailing models in psychotherapy. So the psychoanalyst might trace the client's fear of judgment to, a repressive superego, or the cognitive therapist might challenge the irrational belief system that fuels it. And I think each of these illuminates something important about the client's situation. But the person-centered counsellor listens not, for distortion, but simply for experience. They don't interpret, they accompany the client without trying to educate them, and just trusting that their experience coming through will be enough to support growth. And I think that this approach requires a certain intellectual humility that is missed from a lot of the more psychodynamic or cognitive models, because it asks us to suspend our powerful desire to solve, to explain, to name, to intellectualize what the client is experiencing. And instead we have to kind of cultivate a profound openness, something that's kind of saying, I don't know what this person needs, but they might know. And all I need to do is help them to figure that out. In Carl Rogers' model, nowhere is this more important than in the case of the self-concept, which is what we take ourselves to be. Worthy or worthless, lovable or burdensome. And these self-concepts organize all our subsequent experience. And what Carl Rogers found is that when experience contradicts the self-concept, it's often denied or simply not perceived by the client. So someone that thinks they're lovable based on having come from perhaps a family that loved them and routinely reinforced that self-concept, moments where they're treated as unlovable don't register in the same way as the person who has been unloved in the past. With the person that has experienced rejection and abandonment, the therapeutic task becomes one of integration, of allowing parts of the self, the lovable parts, for example, to either return or to grow and develop through the therapist's acceptance. One metaphor that I explore in the book is of the traffic intersection. If you imagine a traffic intersection without lights or signals, where thoughts, feelings, and needs, crash into one another in a lot of disorder and chaos. The person-centred counsellor is not trying to direct the traffic, but they provide, as it were, the rules of the road, the safety, the reflection, the empathy. And in doing so, the client becomes more capable of directing themselves. The enduring insight from the person-centred approach is that therapy is not a treatment for the person, but it's a dialogue with them, a shared inquiry into the meaning of their experience. And it's about standing beside them, listening with our full presence and saying, you matter, your experience matters. So let's begin there. And that's kind of what therapy is about in the person-centred approach. I think there are some major limitations to this. It's a beautiful foundational model to psychotherapy that's very well supported by the evidence. But in the next video, I want to kind of look at how this model doesn't encapsulate everything that happens in the room with the client, and seeing from, in next week's video, a psychodynamic perspective can help us to empathize and accept the client, but thinking a bit more about the unconscious, processes in the room. So I think we'll leave it there for now, and just thanks for listening, and yeah, look forward to seeing you in the next video.